The wind brought a strange sound down from the rocky hills, a sound that did not belong to any bird or animal Daniel Hale knew. He was checking a broken section of fence at the edge of his land when he first heard it, thin and shaking, like crying. He stood still and listened. It came again, weaker this time, carried by the cold morning air. A large nest sat broken among the rocks. It was made of thick branches, bones, and dried mud, built high enough that a grown man could stand inside it without touching the top. But now it was torn apart. Branches were scattered across the ground, and deep claw marks cut through the dirt. Dark, dried blood stained the stones near the edge of the nest. Daniel's stomach turned. He had heard stories about the dragons that lived in these hills, wild and dangerous animals that no settler on this colony dared to approach. Everyone said to leave them alone. And now, standing in front of a destroyed nest, he understood why people were afraid. Then the crying sound came again, closer this time. Daniel walked toward the center of the wreckage and found two small shapes curled together beneath a broken branch. They were baby dragons, no bigger than dogs, their scales still soft and their wings folded tight against their bodies. One had scales the color of dark red coals. The other was pale, almost silver blue, like frost on a window. Both of them were shaking, and both of them were crying. There was no sign of their mother anywhere near the nest, only drag marks leading away into the rocks, as if something large had been pulled or dragged from the site. Daniel crouched down slowly, keeping his movements calm. The red one hissed weakly and tried to back away, but it was too tired and too hungry to move far. The pale one did not move at all. It only stared up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Daniel knew the rules of the colony. Wild dragons were left alone. If a nest was destroyed, it was reported to the rangers, and nothing more was done. Getting close to any dragon, especially a baby one, was considered reckless and dangerous. But looking down at these two small creatures, starving and alone in the ruins of their home, Daniel could not make himself walk away. He took off his jacket and wrapped it around both of them together, lifting them carefully against his chest. They were heavier than they looked, and warmer too, despite their shaking. Neither of them fought him. By the time he started walking back down the hill, the pale one had pressed its head against his arm and gone quiet. The walk back to his homestead felt longer than it had going up. Daniel kept glancing at the two small dragons in his arms, half expecting them to bite him or try to run. But they only huddled closer, exhausted and afraid, letting him carry them all the way to his door. Word spread through the small settlement faster than Daniel expected. By the next afternoon, Warden Nolan, the head of the local rangers, was standing on his porch with his arms folded, looking down at the two hatchlings sleeping near the fireplace. "You know this is against every safety rule we have," Nolan said. His voice was flat, but not unkind. "Dragons are not pets, Daniel. They grow fast, and they grow dangerous. In a few months, those two will be strong enough to knock down a wall. In a year, they could burn this house to the ground without even meaning to." Daniel did not look away from the fireplace, where the red dragon had curled itself around the pale one, both of them finally sleeping peacefully for the first time since he found them. "Their mother is gone," he said quietly. "Something killed her and tore that nest apart. If I leave them out there, they die within days. I'm not doing that." Nolan sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "You understand I can't officially allow this. If the colony council finds out, they'll order the dragons removed, maybe destroyed, depending on how nervous people get." "Then don't tell them," Daniel said simply. Nolan looked at him for a long moment, then glanced back at the two sleeping hatchlings. Something in his expression softened slightly, though he did not admit it out loud. "You're either the bravest man on this colony," he finally said, "or the most foolish. I haven't decided which yet." After Nolan left, Daniel sat by the fireplace for a long time, watching the two dragons breathe slowly in their sleep. He thought about the empty nest on the hill, the blood on the stones, and the drag marks leading away into the rocks. Whatever had killed their mother was still out there somewhere, and it had not left by accident. But for now, the two hatchlings were warm, fed, and safe, curled together in front of the fire in a small house at the edge of a quiet colony. Daniel did not know yet how much his life was about to change because of the choice he had just made. He only knew that he was not going to let two crying baby dragons die alone on a broken mountain, no matter what the rules said, and no matter what it might cost him later. The smell of burnt wood became part of Daniel's morning routine faster than he expected. It was the third week after he brought the 2 dragons home, and he had already replaced 1 chair, 2 blankets, and the corner of his kitchen table. The red dragon, who Daniel had started calling Cinder because of the way sparks jumped off her scales when she got excited, was the main cause of most of the damage. She hiccuped small bursts of fire whenever she got too eager, especially around mealtime. The pale dragon was different. She rarely made a sound, and spent most of her time hiding under the porch or pressed against the wall in the corner of the room. Daniel began calling her Frost, both for her pale blue scales and for the way she kept her distance from everything, cold and careful. It took her almost 2 full weeks before she allowed Daniel to touch her without flinching. Raising 2 baby dragons turned out to be nothing like Daniel had imagined. They ate constantly, slept in strange positions piled on top of each other, and grew noticeably bigger every few days. Cinder learned to climb onto the kitchen counter within a month, knocking over anything within reach. Frost, on the other hand, learned to open the latch on the back door using her claws, letting herself out whenever she wanted quiet time alone in the yard. Grace Walker, Daniel's closest neighbor, became one of the few people who knew the full truth. She worked in the colony's supply office and had access to information about animal care that Daniel did not. She showed up one afternoon with a crate full of dried meat and mineral supplements, setting it down on his porch without being asked. "You can't feed baby dragons the same food you eat," she said, stepping past him into the house. "They need more protein than a grown man eats in a week, and minerals for their scales too, or the scales grow soft and crack." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How do you know all this?" Grace shrugged. "I read old survey reports from before the colony was built. Nobody expected settlers to actually raise dragons, so there isn't much information, but there's enough to keep them from getting sick." She glanced toward the corner of the room, where Frost was watching her carefully from behind a chair. "She's shy." "She's careful," Daniel corrected. "Cinder is the reckless one." As if hearing her name, Cinder came bounding into the room, knocking over a small stool in the process, and immediately tried to climb onto Grace's boots. Grace laughed and knelt down to scratch behind the young dragon's ear ridges, earning a pleased chirping sound in response. Word about the 2 dragons spread slowly through the small settlement, first as rumors, then as confirmed fact once a few neighbors caught glimpses of Cinder chasing chickens across Daniel's yard. Reactions were mixed. Some people were nervous, keeping their children away from Daniel's property out of caution. Others were simply curious, occasionally stopping by to watch the young dragons from a safe distance. Warden Nolan visited again near the end of the 2nd month, this time without warning. Daniel expected another lecture about safety codes, but instead found the warden standing quietly at the edge of the porch, watching Frost sleep curled against Daniel's leg, while Cinder dozed nearby with her head resting on his boot. "They trust you," Nolan said, sounding almost surprised. "They don't have anyone else," Daniel replied. Nolan was quiet for a moment, studying the 2 sleeping dragons. "I've read reports about dragons in the wild. They're solitary animals, mostly. Mothers raise their young alone, and once grown, dragons rarely bond with anything, not even each other." He shook his head slowly. "What you have here isn't normal. Is that a problem?" "I don't know yet," Nolan admitted. "But I keep an eye on how attached they get to you. Dragons that bond that strongly tend to react badly if that bond is ever threatened." Daniel did not fully understand what Nolan meant by that warning, not until months later. For now, life on the homestead settled into something like a routine, if a routine could include feeding 2 rapidly growing dragons, patching burnt furniture, and chasing Frost out of the neighbor's garden more than once. Despite the chaos, Daniel found himself growing more attached to the 2 young dragons with each passing week. Cinder's boldness made him laugh more than he expected, and Frost's quiet trust, earned slowly and carefully, meant more to him than he wanted to admit out loud. He began to understand that whatever this bond was, it was not something he had planned for, and it was not something he was willing to give up. At night, when the 2 dragons curled together near the fireplace, their breathing slow and steady, Daniel would sit nearby and watch them, thinking about the empty nest on the hill and the unanswered question of what had really killed their mother. He did not know yet that the answer was already moving toward his homestead, carried on ships that did not belong to anyone in the colony, searching quietly for two hatchlings that were never supposed to survive. 3 sets of tracks led away from the old nest, and none of them belonged to an animal. Daniel noticed them first, kneeling in the dirt near the broken branches that had once formed Cinder and Frost's home. The tracks were narrow, evenly spaced, and pressed deep into the ground, the kind of marks made by boots, not claws. He had come back to the nest with Grace 2 months after finding the hatchlings, mostly out of curiosity, wanting to understand what had really happened to their mother. What they found instead answered every question and raised a dozen new ones. "These aren't rangers," Grace said, crouching beside him and studying the tracks. "The boot pattern is wrong. Colony gear doesn't look like this." Daniel moved further into the wreckage of the nest, searching through broken branches and old bones. Near the center, half buried under dirt, he found something that made his stomach drop. It was a surgical blade, small and precise, the kind used for careful cutting rather than hunting. Nearby lay strips of thick, leathery material that looked disturbingly like dragon scale, carefully removed rather than torn. "They didn't kill the mother by accident," Daniel said quietly, holding up the blade. "Someone hunted her. On purpose. And they took pieces of her with them." Grace's face went pale. She had grown up hearing stories about traders from outside the colony, groups that dealt in rare goods across dozens of systems, but she had never imagined something like that reaching this quiet, forgotten settlement. "There are markets for things like dragon scale," she said slowly. "Blood too, sometimes bone. Rich buyers pay enormous amounts for parts from creatures nobody else can get close to." They walked the tracks further along the ridge until they found a flattened patch of grass, wide and circular, exactly the shape of a small transport ship that had landed and later taken off again. Daniel stood at the center of it, looking out toward the horizon, feeling a cold unease settle into his chest. 2 days later, Daniel and Grace saw the ship again, this time from a distance, hovering low over the hills near the old nest site before disappearing behind the ridge. It was sleek, dark, and clearly not built by anyone in the colony. Daniel reported it to Warden Nolan immediately, but by the time rangers reached the area, the ship was gone without a trace. The visits continued over the following weeks, each one closer to Daniel's homestead than the last. Then, on a quiet evening while Daniel was repairing the fence near his house, a stranger arrived on foot, dressed in a clean gray uniform that marked him as an outsider even before he spoke. "You have something that belongs to my employer," the man said, his voice calm and businesslike. He introduced himself only as a representative of the Talvern Combine, a name Daniel had never heard before. "2 juvenile dragons. We are prepared to compensate you generously for their return, along with a payment for your discretion regarding this conversation." Daniel set down his tools slowly, keeping his expression steady despite the anger building in his chest. "Your employer killed their mother," he said, "cut pieces off her, and left her babies to starve in a broken nest." The representative did not deny it. He simply adjusted his sleeve, unbothered. "The Combine deals in valuable resources. Dragon scale, blood, and bone fetch high prices across several trade networks. The mother was simply an opportunity. The hatchlings represent unfinished business, nothing more." "They're not resources," Daniel said, his voice low and hard. "They're mine now, and they're not for sale." The representative studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether Daniel understood the seriousness of what he was refusing. "That is an unwise position to take," he said finally. "The Combine does not enjoy loose ends. I would reconsider before this becomes difficult for you and everyone around you." He turned and walked back toward the trees without waiting for a response, disappearing into the fading evening light as quietly as he had arrived. Daniel stood at the fence for a long time after the man left, watching the empty trail where the stranger had gone. Inside the house, he could hear Cinder chirping happily over something, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place outside. Frost, however, had come to sit by the window, watching the trees with unusual stillness, as if she somehow understood that something dangerous had just come close to her home. That night, Daniel told Grace everything that had happened. She listened quietly, her expression growing more serious with every detail. When he finished, she was silent for a moment before speaking. "You need to tell Nolan everything," she said. "And you need to prepare for the possibility that these people are not going to simply walk away." Daniel looked toward the fireplace, where Cinder and Frost lay curled together, safe and warm for now. He knew Grace was right. Whatever the Talvern Combine wanted, they were not going to give up easily, and the quiet, simple life he had built with the two dragons was about to become far more complicated than he had ever expected. By the time the first frost came early that year, Cinder was too large to fit through the back door without ducking her head. Nearly 5 months had passed since Daniel found the two hatchlings on the broken mountain, and both dragons had grown far faster than anyone expected. Cinder now stood taller than Daniel at the shoulder, her wings stretching wide enough to cast shade over half the yard when she stretched them. Frost had grown just as quickly, though her frame stayed leaner, built more for speed and precision than raw size. Their abilities had grown alongside their bodies. Cinder no longer produced small hiccups of flame by accident. She could now breathe a controlled stream of fire hot enough to scorch stone, though she still struggled to aim it properly when excited. Frost's ability had developed in the opposite direction, a cold breath that could freeze water solid within seconds or coat a surface in thick, slippery ice. Daniel had learned this the hard way after Frost accidentally froze the porch steps solid one morning, sending him sliding straight into the mud. Despite the growing danger their abilities represented, the bond between Daniel and the two dragons had only deepened. Cinder followed him everywhere she was allowed, chirping happily whenever he returned from checking the fields. Frost, once so distant and careful, now slept curled against his side most nights, her cold scales somehow comforting rather than uncomfortable once he grew used to it. The warning from the Combine representative weighed heavily on Daniel's mind, and he had spent the following weeks reinforcing his homestead as best he could. Grace helped him install stronger locks and sensor lights around the perimeter, using old colony equipment she managed to acquire through her position in the supply office. Warden Nolan, though still cautious about the situation, began quietly increasing ranger patrols near Daniel's land, careful not to draw too much attention from the colony council. The first real test came on a moonless night, nearly 2 weeks after Daniel's conversation with the Combine representative. Sensor lights near the tree line flickered on suddenly, catching movement at the edge of the property. Daniel was awake within seconds, grabbing the rifle he kept by the door, but Cinder was already moving before he reached the porch, a low growl rumbling in her chest. 3 figures in dark, close-fitting suits moved quickly through the trees, carrying equipment that looked more suited to capturing something than fighting it. Nets, tranquilizer darts, and restraint cables were visible even in the dim light. They clearly intended to take the dragons alive, likely still valuable enough to the Combine, even if slightly damaged in the process. Cinder reached them first, releasing a burst of fire that lit up the yard and sent one of the figures diving out of the way, his equipment scattering across the ground. Frost moved just as fast, circling wide and releasing a blast of freezing air that coated the ground beneath the intruders' feet, sending them slipping and stumbling as they tried to retreat. Daniel fired a warning shot into the air, more to announce his position than to hit anyone, and shouted for the intruders to stop. Instead, they scattered, moving quickly back toward the tree line where a small transport waited, engines already humming. Cinder chased them halfway to the trees before Daniel called her back, worried about her running too far from the house alone in the dark. By the time the transport lifted off and disappeared into the night sky, the intruders were gone, leaving behind only scattered equipment and deep scorch marks across the yard. No one had been seriously hurt, but the message was clear. The Combine was not bluffing, and they were not going to stop after one failed attempt. News of the attacks spread through the small settlement within a day. Rather than turning neighbors against Daniel, as he had feared, the attacks seemed to rally them instead. Several families who had once kept a cautious distance from the dragons began showing up at his homestead, offering help reinforcing defenses or simply bringing supplies. Grace organized informal patrols among the closest neighbors, and Warden Nolan finally stopped pretending the situation could remain quietly ignored, openly assigning extra rangers to the area. "You didn't just adopt 2 dragons," Nolan told Daniel one evening, watching Cinder and Frost patrol the edge of the yard together, clearly more alert and protective than they had been just weeks earlier. "You built something this colony didn't know it needed. A line that outsiders can't just walk over." Daniel watched his 2 dragons in the fading light, both of them now capable of real danger, both of them still choosing to stay close to him despite everything. He thought about the Combine representative's warning, the promise that things would become difficult if he refused to give up Cinder and Frost. He had made his choice long before that warning, standing in the wreckage of a broken nest with 2 crying hatchlings in his arms. Whatever came next, he was not backing down now, and neither, it seemed, were Cinder and Frost. The sky over Daniel's homestead turned orange long before sunrise, though no sun was rising. The light came from 3 transport ships descending fast over the tree line, engines glowing hot against the dark sky, followed by a 4th larger vessel that hovered high above the others, clearly commanding the operation. The Combine had stopped sending scouts. This time, they had come to finish what they started. Daniel was already awake when the sensor lights flared across the entire perimeter at once, alarms echoing through the quiet night. Cinder was on her feet instantly, a deep growl building in her chest, while Frost moved to the window, her pale eyes narrowing at the approaching ships. Within minutes, armed figures began dropping from the transports, moving in organized formations across the fields surrounding the homestead. Grace arrived at Daniel's door within moments, having seen the lights from her own home just down the road, a rifle slung across her shoulder and 2 of the neighboring men close behind her. "There's more than a dozen of them," she said quickly, breathing hard from running. "Nolan's Rangers are on their way, but it will take time to reach us." Daniel nodded, checking his own weapon while Cinder paced restlessly near the door, waiting for his signal. "We hold them here as long as we can," he said. "Cinder and Frost know this land better than any of them." The first wave of combined soldiers reached the outer fence within minutes, cutting through the wire with practiced efficiency. Cinder met them before they could advance further, releasing a wide burst of fire across the field that forced the entire line to scatter, several soldiers diving for cover behind overturned equipment crates. Frost moved along the opposite side, freezing the ground beneath a second group's feet, sending them sliding helplessly as Grace and the 2 neighboring men opened fire from behind cover near the house. The battle quickly became chaotic. Soldiers who had expected to face a single homestead with minimal resistance instead found themselves fighting 2 fully grown dragons working in coordinated bursts of fire and ice, backed by determined settlers who refused to give ground. Explosive charges meant to stun the dragons detonated across the field, filling the air with smoke and dust, but neither Cinder nor Frost slowed down, driven by an instinct to protect the only home and family they had ever known. A group of soldiers managed to break through near the barn, moving to flank the house from the side. Daniel spotted them first, shouting a warning as he fired toward their position. Frost reacted instantly, cutting off their advance with a wall of ice that rose suddenly from the ground, buying just enough time for Grace and the others to redirect their fire. High above the battlefield, the larger Combine vessel began descending closer, clearly preparing to deploy heavier equipment or reinforcements. Daniel realized that if that ship landed, the battle would shift dangerously against them. He grabbed a flare gun from the supply crate near the porch and fired it directly at the approaching ship, more out of desperation than strategy, hoping to distract its pilots even for a moment. The flare struck one of the ship's stabilizing thrusters, causing it to lurch sideways unexpectedly. Cinder, seeing the ship falter, launched herself into the air for the first time in true combat, wings beating hard as she climbed toward the wounded vessel. She released a powerful stream of fire directly into the damaged thruster, and the ship began losing altitude rapidly, forcing its pilots to pull back and retreat toward higher ground rather than risk a crash. With their command vessel damaged and retreating, the remaining Combine soldiers on the ground began falling back as well, their coordinated formation breaking apart into a disorganized retreat. Frost pursued the closest group briefly, freezing their equipment solid enough to slow their escape, while Cinder circled back toward the house, landing hard in the yard beside Daniel, her scales scorched but her posture proud and unbroken. Warden Nolan's Rangers arrived just as the last Combine transport lifted off, capturing 2 soldiers who had been left behind in the chaos, along with a significant amount of equipment abandoned during the retreat. The captured operatives, shaken and clearly unprepared for the level of resistance they had faced, offered little resistance once restrained. As the smoke cleared over the battlefield, Daniel walked slowly across the scorched and frozen ground, checking on Grace and the two neighboring men, all of them exhausted but unharmed. Cinder pressed close against his side, still breathing hard from the fight, while Frost limped slightly from a minor injury but remained fiercely alert, watching the horizon for any sign of the Combine's return. Nolan surveyed the damage with a grim expression, shaking his head slowly. "They came prepared for a simple extraction," he said. "They didn't expect this." Daniel looked at his two dragons, both of them battered but standing firm beside him, and then at Grace and his neighbors, all of whom had chosen to stand and fight rather than walk away. "Neither did I," he admitted quietly, "but I'm glad they were wrong." News of the battle reached farther than Daniel ever expected, traveling along trade routes far beyond the colony's small corner of space. The two captured Combine operatives were handed over to colonial authorities within days, and their testimony, combined with the equipment left behind on the battlefield, gave investigators more than enough evidence to link the Talvern Combine to illegal hunting operations across several systems. What had started as a single quiet homestead defending itself became the center of a growing investigation that threatened the Combine's entire trade network. For the first few weeks after the attack, life on the colony felt strange and unsettled. Rangers maintained a heavier presence near Daniel's land, and occasional unfamiliar ships still passed overhead at a distance, though none dared land again after what had happened. Cinder's injuries healed quickly, her scorched scales growing back darker and tougher than before. Frost's limp faded within days, though she remained more watchful than ever, rarely straying far from either Daniel or her sister. Grace visited often, no longer bringing supplies out of secrecy but openly, along with several other neighbors who had once kept their distance out of fear. Children from nearby homesteads, previously warned to stay far away from Daniel's property, now sometimes gathered at a respectful distance along the fence line, watching Cinder and Frost with wide, curious eyes rather than fear. Warden Nolan arrived one afternoon carrying an official-looking document, something Daniel had not seen from him before. The Colony Council reviewed everything that happened here, Nolan explained, handing over the papers. "Given the circumstances, and given what you and these two accomplished, they've agreed to recognize your homestead as an official protected sanctuary, first of its kind in this system." Daniel read through the document slowly, still finding it hard to believe. It formally acknowledged Cinder and Frost as protected residents of the colony rather than wild animals subject to removal, and it granted Daniel legal standing to continue caring for them without fear of future interference from local authorities. It also, quietly but clearly, placed the full weight of colonial law behind protecting them from any future attempts by outside parties to take them by force. "I didn't expect this," Daniel admitted, looking up from the papers. Nolan allowed himself a small, rare smile. "Neither did I, honestly. But after watching what happened out there, I don't think anyone on this council wanted to be the one explaining why we didn't protect the people and the dragons, who fought off an entire extraction team on their own." As the months passed, life slowly settled into a new kind of normal. Cinder and Frost, now fully grown, remained close to Daniel by choice, though nothing legally or physically bound them to stay. They could have left at any time, flying off into the wild hills where dragons were said to roam free, answering to no one. Instead, they chose to remain at the homestead, patrolling the surrounding land, occasionally startling unfamiliar visitors who had not yet grown used to the sight of two massive dragons treating a quiet human settlement as their home. Word of what had happened on this small, previously unremarkable colony eventually reached traders and officials from other systems, carried along the same routes the Combine had once used for their hunting operations. The story shifted slightly with each retelling, but the core of it remained the same. A single human had taken in two orphan dragons out of simple compassion, refused to give them up under threat, and stood alongside them when an entire armed operation tried to take them by force. Other species who dealt in trade and resources across known space took quiet notice. Dragons, long considered dangerous, unpredictable creatures too wild to bond meaningfully with anything, had apparently formed a bond stronger than many treaties and contracts, simply because one human had decided they were worth protecting, no matter the cost. It was not the kind of story that fit neatly into anyone's expectations about value, resources, or practical decision-making. And that was exactly what made it spread so far. On a quiet evening nearly a year after Daniel first heard the sound of crying carried on the wind, he walked back up to the old nest site on the ridge, Cinder and Frost flying lazily above him rather than walking at his side, clearly capable now of covering that distance in seconds if they chose. The nest itself had changed since that first day. Grass had grown over the scorched ground, and the broken branches had long since been cleared away or buried beneath new growth. Daniel stood at the edge of the ridge, watching his two dragons circle overhead against the darkening sky, remembering the two starving, crying hatchlings he had carried home wrapped in his jacket, uncertain if he was making the right decision. He had never expected any of this, not the danger, not the fight, not the strange kind of family he had built almost by accident. Cinder landed first, nudging her head gently against his shoulder, followed a moment later by Frost settling quietly on his other side. Daniel reached out and rested a hand on each of them, looking out over the quiet, peaceful hills that had once held only tragedy and fear. Whatever came next for the colony, for the Combine, or for the wider galaxy, slowly learning what humans were capable of when something helpless needed protecting, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He had never once regretted the choice he made on that broken mountain, and he never would.